So, I like anime. Not a very controversial thing to say, especially nowadays. You know, everyone and their mothers probably watched some type of anime in the past couple years, what with the pandemic and way too much free time, quite frankly. It's inescapable. I grew up on things such as Naruto, Pokemon, Dragon Ball, One Piece, Fairy Tail, and probably some others I cannot remember off the top of my head. But when getting into a certain genre of shows, movies, animation, whatever else, you tend to look out for recommendations for what may be good or may suit your pre-existing tastes. For example, you'll often get folks recommending you some of the most popular stuff when it comes to anime. Things like Demon Slayer, JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, you know, maybe something more slice of life and relaxed like K-On! or Lucky Star, or maybe something more emotional like A Silent Voice or even Anohana. Basically, you'll always get recommended something, maybe even if you don't want a recommendation, quite frankly, but more often than not, there's a good chance you'll enjoy at least one of the things that you're recommended. I've had my own general taste in anime, and what I enjoy for the most part from it changed drastically from even just one recommendation for a friend. It's some powerful stuff, but this is basically me saying hello everyone. Today I'm going to be recommending you an anime and manga that you may or may not like, but I think it's one of the better ones in the genre. So, let's get to it. Before we do that, I just want to mention that if you enjoy this type of content and want to support the channel, consider supporting my Patreon. For only $5 a month, you get early access to these videos and even your name in the credits of the video. If you can't do so, or don't want to, however, no worries. A like and a sub is absolutely more than enough. Anyway, back to the video. So, the subject for today's video, in case you somehow could not read, is Hinamatsuri. Hinamatsuri was a manga created by Masao Otake and ran from June 2010 to July 2020, with a final run of 100 chapters all compiled into 19 manga volumes, with an anime adaptation releasing from April 6th to June 22nd in 2018. But with Hinamatsuri, and more specifically its anime adaptation, it's become a huge favorite of mine in recent years due to how it manages to balance humor and heartwarming moments. Not only the show, but the manga have made me laugh so many times, but probably just as many times gotten me emotional with how they handle their characters. Whether it be a character becoming homeless and then learning valuable life lessons with a camp of fellow homeless people, all of which are treated and portrayed in such an incredibly respectful and understanding way. Or the main character and her father figure and their growth from the start of the series to the end of it, going from unwilling to refer to each other as such to feeling as though they truly are a father and a daughter. Or even back to the humor with ridiculous amount of insane happenings, some of which sadly didn't make it into the anime. One of which that comes to mind is a whole chapter where one of the main girls accidentally goes to military training instead of English classes. And at the end of it all, after her instructor's crazy shenanigans, she serves a customer asking if she knows any English and replies with a smile and "Yo, motherfucker." It's over-the-top humor like this mixed with wholesome moments that really bring Hinamatsuri's manga and anime to be one of my absolute favorites. But enough talking in non-specifics. I want to talk a bit more in-depth without giving everything away to give you all a better idea of what you're getting into with the manga and anime as a whole. I'll try and keep spoilers in this video to a minimum, and we'll be talking about the basic premise of Hinamatsuri, then giving a brief rundown of a couple of episodes of the anime that set up the main characters you'll be following for the entirety of it. And lastly, covering some differences between the anime and manga and how the anime fares for an adaptation. Enough exposition and explanations though. Hinamatsuri begins with the Yakuza man named Yoshifumi Nita, enjoying the view from his nice-looking apartment and closing out a deal for a vase, when suddenly, a weird metal pod drops and hits him on the head, containing a person? Nita, thinking he must have been just drinking too much, goes to bed, only to wake up the next day and realize that, nope, there's a very real thing that he's gonna have to deal with. The person in the pod then asks Nita to press the switch on the back and get her out of it, and he begrudgingly does so, revealing them to just be some kid. The kid then asks Nita to give them some clothes, and when he doesn't immediately do so, they reveal they have psychic powers and destroy his entire vase collection. After providing her with some clothes, she reveals her name is Hina. As for anything else pertaining to her just showing up or her powers, she doesn't really reveal anything else. The following day, Hina realizes she doesn't really have anything beyond what clothes Nita gave her, so she strong-arms him via her psychic powers into buying her a bunch of stuff. About 850,000 yen worth of stuff. And after all that heavy spending, Hina wants some high-end sushi or Kobe beef for some reason. While not a major plot point, I figured I'd mention this while talking about sushi, but Hina absolutely loves salmon roe. It's a huge part of Hinamatsuri in that you'll see it in a bunch of stuff relating to the series. Hell, the first manga cover has her holding some. It's in the main promo image for the anime, you get the idea. It's absolutely everywhere. You'll see it a bunch. Anyway, back to the show. After taking his not daughter out to eat, while Nita reflects on how Hina's just kind of a normal kid when she isn't terrorizing his vase collection, Hina overhears a report on TV about a school vice president embezzling funds and decides she wants to go to school. No, I'm not making this up. In case you couldn't tell, Hina isn't really too normal for lack of a better word. She's a kid with psychic powers who was transported randomly here from an unknown time and world, and she reflects on occasion about how Nita doesn't give her orders, presumably something she did before she was teleported. On top of that, she doesn't really show too much emotion. She's very reserved and monotone more often than not, although do not fear, she will not stay completely stoic and emotionless, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, Hina goes to school and just kind of sleeps and eats all day. Nothing much else to add there. Although here at school is where we meet another one of our main characters and someone who weirdly ends up becoming insanely important later on, and that is Hitomi Mishima. She's one of Hina's fellow classmates and has some issues we'll get to later, but I want to wrap up the general happenings of the first episode before moving on to her. While out on a job that Hina assisted with her psychic powers, Nita receives a call that the boss of his Yakuza family was shot, to which he is reprimanded by his lieutenant and then told to get revenge on the opposing family that did it. Also, Hina's here drinking some tea.
さすが最高級の玉露。
それ100均のだよ。
And after a stellar review of the tea, Nita goes through with his order and makes his way to the opposing family's offices to do just what he was ordered to do. Out of time and ideas, Nita scrambles to come up with something when Hina surprises him in the car and offers to deal with the situation if he orders her to. Nita, not wanting to take advantage of Hina's power as she's hinted other adults have done before, gives pushback to the idea and that it isn't her problem to deal with. Hina expresses gratitude to Nita for not being like the other adults and not bossing her around, and goes through with dealing with the problem at hand anyway. After about 18 ouchies later, Hina returns with the boss and that's the job done. And as will be a reoccurring thing in Hinamatsuri, Nita is praised for his handling of the situation and respected greatly by his fellow Yakuza men, and essentially earns a crazy reputation as a result. But with all that said and done, Crime Daddy Nita treats his psychic daughter to a big bowl of salmon roe. Ain't that just the sweetest? Now onto our second character, who I briefly mentioned earlier, Hitomi Mishima. As I mentioned earlier, she's Hina's classmate and she's got some issues. What are those issues, you may wonder? She can't say no to anything, ever. Let me explain with a situation that ends up becoming a huge part of her character. One day at school, Hina mentions to Hitomi how Nita's been acting strange lately and only giving her canned food for dinner, so they decide to try and follow him and see what he's up to. They end up losing track of him after a bit, so Hina suggests they go to where she last saw him, a bar Nita frequents called Little Song. Hina, after realizing the owner isn't there and that the place is closed, tells Hitomi to wait at the bar while she looks for Hina. Well, unfortunately for Hitomi, a drunk man walks into the bar and asks for a drink and even offers to show her how to make it, much to her dismay. Hina bumps into the bar owner while, quote-unquote, looking for Nita, and they return back to Little Song, only to find Nita and a bunch of others enjoying drinks being prepared by Hitomi. Here's as good a time as any to mention Hitomi's other big issue. She is way too good at just about anything she does. It's terrifying. So not only can she not decline any offer for work or anything despite being a literal middle schooler, she's also way too damn good at all of it. Now I'm sure what you're thinking, well, her just stumbling into this doesn't necessarily mean she has to stay a bartender, right? Well, it's a fair point. Except for the owner of the bar, Utako, who is actually just the worst, blackmails Hitomi into staying at this job by threatening to inform her school of her being at the bar if she doesn't comply. Hitomi, being big-brained, had decided to record this interaction on the off chance Utako said anything incriminating and informed her of this. Utako then decides, hey, you know what, let's just both delete our evidence and we'll be even, we'll be fine. Except it won't, because after deleting the evidence, Utako reveals she'd already backed up her dirt on Hitomi to her fucking computer.
転送してある。大切りです。そういうわけで仕事をすることになってしまいました。
And that's why Hitomi is a bartender. Our next main character is Anzu, another psychic from the world Hina comes from, who comes here in search of Hina. When she arrives, she comes across a biker gang, beats them up, takes their leader's clothes, and dips. Anzu is basically the polar opposite of Hina, where Hina is very reserved, monotone, and mostly quiet. Anzu is boisterous, obnoxious, and loud. Nita stumbles across Anzu and eventually overhears her mentioning how she's hunting down Hina. So he gets the idea to just bring Hina to her so they can settle whatever issue they have with each other and just get it out the way. So they battle it out, sort of, and Anzu loses pretty quickly. After taking the biggest L of the century, they hang out and have a generally good time together. How sweet. With that, Anzu decides to return back to where she came, having come here to retrieve Hina in the first place, but decides instead to just tell her superiors Hina died or something. One little issue though, when hanging out, Nita had put their clothes in the wash, and as a result, her mechanism she used to be transported here no longer works. Uh-oh. Anzu is now homeless. And last up is a character some of you may already be familiar with, that being Mao. So, one thing I actually lied about earlier is that the show actually begins with a flash forward in the canon of Hinamatsuri and has Mao fighting off a group of folks. The reason I mention that some folks may already know Mao is because of the most popular clip of Hinamatsuri on YouTube is actually one primarily featuring Mao. With a terrifying 10 million views, the clip is basically just Mao using her psychic powers disguised as some type of martial arts. It's pretty funny all things considered, although given the lack of context in any way provided for this clip, I'm surprised that it's the most viewed clip to begin with, but it's still a neat thing. As for Mao herself, she is yet another psychic teleported to hunt down Hina, although unluckily for Mao, she accidentally gets teleported to a deserted island. On this island, she's at least able to get some food, make some shelter, and more or less survive decently enough. She eventually turns some coconuts into little heads of Anzu and Hina, which she talks to and copes heavily with. Oh god, does she cope. She literally makes food for the coconut heads and gives it to them, only to grab it back and eat it. It's depressing. But days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months, and about 200 days later, Mao breaks and can't stand the loneliness or coping anymore. She has a meltdown, throws out her coconut heads, and decides to finally leave the island by making a raft with the help of her psychic powers. She's never really completely sane after this and always has some dolls of Anzu and Hina and kind of talks to them, even years later. So she's a little crazy, but hey, with what she went through, fair enough. And that's our main set of characters. Very concerning characters, but they're great and all manage to have their own little moments and individual arcs that really let Hinamatsuri shine. Now, obviously there are other main characters or even side characters that I didn't mention or put much emphasis on, such as Nita, but considering most arcs center around one of these four, I figured it'd be good to set them up so you knew what you were getting into. But aside from that, the anime runs for 13 episodes and covers up until chapter 48 or so of the manga. Surprisingly, there's a huge chunk of content that didn't get adapted in the anime from the manga. Roughly speaking, the anime skips about 20 chapters, and that's not even counting any bonus chapters or anything of that sort, which came as a surprise to me because it feels like there's so much going on in the show. When it comes to how the anime adapted whatever it picked up, I'd say it did it pretty well. It stayed mostly true to the source material, although from what I've noticed, it seemed to cut out some stuff earlier on relating to the Yakuza, as some of the earlier chapters feature more of a heavy emphasis on Nita's role as one and things relating to that. My guess would be that they wanted to cut some of that stuff to avoid any potential controversy that would come with it, if they were to put too much emphasis on it, rather, as it'd probably come across as glorifying the Yakuza. But honestly, having watched the whole show and read the whole manga, they never really feel glorified in any real sense. Sure, Nita's lifestyle is glorified to an extent, but he's also portrayed as a bit of a fool, as are a lot of his fellow Yakuza men. They're not really shown to be super competent or the smartest, beyond maybe Nita, and even that's a bit of a stretch. Leaning more into the manga though, it's probably as good a time as any to mention that the early art of Hinamatsuri is a little rough. It's not bad, don't get me wrong, but if you go from the anime to the manga like I did, it can be a little jarring initially. But as the manga progresses, considering it was made over the course of 10 years, you can genuinely see the progression and quality of the art, and it's actually incredible. I won't go too in depth about some of the content that wasn't adapted for the anime, but I want to give you at least a taste of some of the stuff you're missing out on, since there was so much greatness that will hopefully maybe be adapted one day. That is, if the anime were to get a second season. So, what I'll do here is I'll discuss two different chapters, one in the first half of Hinamatsuri and one roughly in the second half. First up, I'll be covering chapter 3 of the manga, taking place in the same general time that Hina enrolls in school. A man wanted for a bank robbery went running into her school and has taken the school, and more specifically, her class, as hostage. What does Hina do in this situation, you may ask? Use her psychic powers to stop him and get everyone to safety? Of course not. What do you think this is? She stands up and tells the man that she's hungry, and despite being threatened by the man with a gun, she continues to say that she's hungry. So he just tells her to grab whatever food she wants, but to at least just be quiet. Watching Hina go back for seconds makes him hungry, so he asks whoever's in charge of serving to get him some as well and shares a meal with her, as well as some of the other classmates. During their meal, Hina asks him, why is he doing this? And as it turns out, the man borrowed money from the Yakuza and they hunted him down after he failed to pay. So he robbed a bank and just kept running after his robbery. The class, now feeling bad for him given his circumstances, begins to brainstorm what his options are and what would be the best thing for him to do. Nita arrives, having heard the situation on the news and using the excuse of collecting his debt, checks on the class only to stumble into their discussion. And after Nita grills him for not having paid back his debt and getting the children involved, the class rallies together to tell the man that regardless of what he picks, they'll support his decision, which moves the man to tears. Crying, he decides to hand Nita the money he robbed from the bank to pay for his debts and to turn himself in, heavily moved by the children helping him figure out what to do despite them being his hostages. Then everyone claps. It sounds cheesy, but honestly, I just love the humanity and humor of it all. Of course, it's ridiculous that the class ends up helping him, but it's weirdly nice that instead of doubling down and causing more issues, he reflected then and there and did what one would consider to be the right thing. I suppose that's technically the message of this chapter as a whole, as roundabout and bizarrely handled as it may be. For a chapter in the later bit of Hinamatsuri, I'll be covering chapter 48, which is actually the first chapter where we see Hina and Nita post-time skip. Taking place 3 years relative to the earlier bits of the story, we see Nita with black hair with Hina, who he now properly refers to as his daughter, and he's introducing himself to his brand new neighbors, as he apparently moved since his old neighbors were causing a fuss due to him being a Yakuza. So it appears as though he's trying to distance himself from this image. At his Yakuza family offices, he tells one of his subordinates to pick him up in a different car, presumably to blend in more with the normal folks. But one of his old sworn brothers mentions that he wants to celebrate his moving to a new place, but Nita declines, and it becomes clear to his fellow Yakuza men that something is up. And his subordinate stalks him for a bit, only to overhear him bad-mouthing the Yakuza to his neighbors. He informs his Yakuza family about this, and they come to the conclusion that he's probably planning to quit the family. So, they try to butter him up by being nice to him, offering to hang out with him, all of which he turns down. And on a drive out, Nita mentions to his subordinate that he wants to take out about 8 million yen, which they all interpret as him planning on taking out some sort of retirement money and finally leave the family. Realizing how dire the situation has gotten, they finally decide to take action and all decide to go see him in person and show their respect to him. Nita, blissfully unaware of the hell that is on its way, is just enjoying a cookout with his neighbors. He's chatting and getting to know everyone and enjoying his time with his neighbors, as well as his psychic daughter. Until suddenly he hears a bunch of cars arriving. They have all arrived at his house, bowing and showing their support in unison to the man that they declare as a legendary Yakuza member to the entire neighborhood to see and hear. Nita realizes it's too late and finally admits to being a Yakuza member and doubles down on it, going out of his way to scare his neighbors. Well, I guess that's one way to get your neighbors to mind their fucking business. It's a great first chapter to what feels like a fresh start for the manga in a sense. And it's also just an overall hilarious chapter. Not to mention the little moments showing Hina and Nita as a proper father and daughter, which is just a cherry on top. Overall, not only do I think this is a great way to start off something like a time skip in Hinamatsuri, it also feels like it puts everything in a different light that allows the manga to push forward with a brand new life. And considering it kept going for another 52 chapters, I'd say it worked pretty well. I also find that I enjoyed the post-time skip chapters of Hinamatsuri more than the pre-time skip. But that's not even to say that I dislike the stuff before that or anything. I just think it somehow manages to elevate Hinamatsuri to new heights that I didn't think were possible, especially given how much I loved the humor and wholesomeness present in the early chapters of it. It's a manga that I actively followed for about 2 years until it ended, and I can completely and wholeheartedly say that it is a phenomenal manga and one of my absolute favorites. Consider checking out the show and then the manga, unless you're lazy and don't read or something, in which case, go fucking just watch the show or something. I don't know. I suppose that's all I really have to say about Hinamatsuri. If you want to check out the anime, I believe it's probably on Crunchyroll or some shit, and the manga is still being officially translated as I'm making this video. But pre-orders for the manga seem to go up to volume 17 out of 19 so far, so the whole manga should be available officially in English by the end of 2022, or maybe a little bit after. Hopefully at least. I cannot recommend it enough. Obviously, there's less than legal methods to experience Hinamatsuri, but that's for you to discover on your own and not for me to mention how to do. But that's about it. I apologize if this video comes across as disorganized in any sense. This is my first time making content on anime and manga, but I hope you enjoyed it regardless. And if you end up checking out the anime or the manga, let me know what you end up thinking. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to support the channel, consider supporting my Patreon. For only $5 a month, you get early access to these videos, as well as your name in the credits of the video. That of which you're probably seeing on screen currently. Now ain't that cool? But if you can't afford to do so, or simply don't want to, no worries. A like and a sub is more than enough. But enough of that, that's it from me. Hope you're all doing well, and stay safe everybody. Bye bye.